Evening. Again, if you haven't figured it out by now, this is something new that we haven't done in the past. A live stream like this on Facebook. We've done other live streaming, and we certainly have been recording our lessons, our sermons for a very, very long time. But I wanted to have the opportunity to have a Bible class on Facebook that would allow some interactivity. And so Facebook really is the kind of it's a good platform for that. So we're going to have this Bible class tonight. We're going to get to the Bible class in just a moment. But the idea here is that if you have some questions or comments that you'd like me to address during the Bible class, you can write those in the comment section underneath the Facebook live feed on our webpage. My wife Ivana is sitting next to me here in the room. She's off camera, but she's with me nonetheless, and she's going to give those questions to me so that I can try to answer those. That may cause me to hesitate a little bit as I'm talking, but that's just the nature of what we're doing this evening. This is about as close, I think, as we can get to a Bible class in the building without being in the building. So again, that's what we're going to be doing this evening. We're going to be doing this on Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. for at least a while as we cover the Intertestamental Period. This is a class that I teach at North Beach. It's a class that I enjoy teaching. There's a lot of things that we cover in this class, and I hope that this live Bible class will be interesting to you as well. Again, you're not going to look at me during this entire time. I'm going to turn the screen over to my PowerPoint slides because I'd like you to be able to watch those and look at those as we go through them. There's going to be a lot of things that I explain from the slides, and it would be a lot better for you to see those rather than seeing me. So let me just make an adjustment here in our stream. And we'll put it up there, and there we go. That's our title slide. So we're going to be talking about the Intertestamental Period. This is the first lesson this evening, Babylon and the Jews. You may remember that a few weeks ago, I did a live stream, not on Facebook, but on the live stream website about Babylon and the Bible. Some of the material that we're going to be looking at this evening is similar to that material, but we're going to be covering a lot of material this evening that we did not cover in that class because it's a different kind of class and on a different topic. So we're going to be talking about the Intertestamental Period just by way of introduction, and then we're going to move on and talk to some things that had to do with Babylon and their relationship with the Jews. So when we talk about the Intertestamental Period, the period that we're talking about here is... need to get that slide going up. There we go. What period are we talking about when we talk about the Intertestamental Period? Well, generally speaking, this period is the period stretching from the end of the Old Testament until the start of the New Testament. Now, that's roughly 400 BC up to 4 BC. And so, strictly speaking, when we talk about the Intertestamental Period, that's really what most people think about. However, for the purposes of this class, we're going to expand that period to include a longer period. We're going to start with the beginning of the Babylonian captivity, hence our topic this evening as we're talking about Babylon and the Jews. We're going to then take that period and stretch that all the way past 4 BC into the New Testament period, and we're going to end with the Jews under Roman control. And so we tack on, if you will, to this period another 300 years or so. But I think it's important because if we just jump right in at 400 BC, we're not going to understand what led up to 400 BC. And if we finish in 4 BC, we really miss some important things concerning the New Testament and what the New Testament is about and how the Jews were faring under Roman control. Now, I need to say this. When I teach this class at North Beach, it's 26 some odd lessons. It goes for a quarter, but it goes 2 classes a week. I don't know exactly how I'm going to make this class go forward. There's going to be some content that I'm probably going to modify as I move through the class, but it's going to be different in content from what I usually teach. Part of that is because some of the things that I teach in a classroom setting really probably wouldn't work very well on this platform. Plus, there are some things that I might want to add to the class that I don't normally talk about. So if you've taken this class before at North Beach, there's going to be some things that are going to be different. There's going to be some things that are the same. And hopefully, if nothing else, it will serve to refresh your memory. If you've never studied the Intertestamental Period, I hope that this will help you understand probably some pretty important things that come from understanding this period. So having said that, why don't we just spend a little time asking ourselves the question, why is this important? Well, studying the Intertestamental Period helps us to span the changes between Malachi and Matthew. And there are some pretty significant cultural and religious and political changes. So when you go to the pages of Malachi, you find the Jews in a very different set of circumstances. They're under, at the end of the New Testament, at the end of the Old Testament period, I should say, they're under Persian rule. You get to the opening words of the New Testament, and the Jews are under Roman control. And in the Old Testament, the Jews are speaking Hebrew and Aramaic. Then you get to the New Testament, and although Hebrew and Aramaic are still being spoken, Greek is the important language. Where in the world did all of that come from? And what got missed in the interim? Well, all of those things that changed during this intertestamental period. And so it's important for us as Bible students to understand these changes. It will help us, I think, to understand better the New Testament and what's going on there and how we got from the end of the Old Testament to the beginning of the New. Another reason why this is important is it will help us to understand the prophecies of Daniel chapter 7 all the way to Daniel chapter 12. You know, it's kind of interesting. When we talk about the book of Daniel, most of the time we spend our time in Daniel chapters 1 through 6. Daniel's chapter 1 through 6, we get Daniel and his friends taken to Babylon. They refuse to eat the king's food. That's in Daniel chapter 1. We get down to Daniel chapter 5. We get the handwriting on the wall. These are stories we're familiar with. Stories, by and large, that our children are familiar with. Lots of good teaching material for our young people come out of Daniel chapter 1 through 6. Then we get to Daniel chapter 7, and we start reading there, and we say, whoa, what in the world happened? Because we go from Daniel 6 to Daniel 7, and it's almost the difference between night and day. We don't know quite exactly what to do with Daniel chapter 7. We get later in the chapters, and it gets even more confusing. And it often becomes a little bit like we're reading the book of Revelation, which of course in the New Testament, that's a book a lot of people shy away from as well. Well, Daniel chapter 7 through 12 are pretty important chapters in the Bible. They are often misunderstood and they are often misinterpreted. In fact, there's quite a bit of false doctrine that's taught in the religious world today that comes from a misinterpretation of Daniel chapter 7 through 12. And so it's important to understand the prophecies of these chapters if we understand something about the intertestamental period. And of course, another reason why it's important to study the intertestamental period is that it helps us to better understand the New Testament itself. The culture in which the New Testament is written. Where does that come from? How did that get to be that way? And so studying the intertestamental period helps in that regard as well. Now, I have to say that as we look at this, we need to understand that the intertestamental period is not our history. It's not things that we're familiar with. If we say 1776 as Americans, we know exactly what that's talking about. If we talk about the Civil War, we know what that's about. If we talk about Pearl Harbor, December 7th, we know what those dates are about. That's our history. The intertestamental period is not our history. But having said that, the Jews of Jesus' day would have been very familiar with this period of time because it was their history. And so some things that we don't understand and some things that we don't know, they would have understood much better because that was their history. And so it helps us to study this period so that we will understand references in the New Testament better than perhaps we already do. So what are we going to cover as we look at this class? Well, I've got to tell you, if we were taking this class, if you were at the church building at North Beach and we were doing this class, if you're doing this online, the answer is going to be the same. What are we going to cover? We're going to cover lots of history, okay? I usually tell people that take my class at North Beach that if you don't like history, you're probably not going to like this class because there's lots of history, and we have to talk about a lot of historical things. Now, I like history. History is something really special to me. My degree from the university is in history, and so history is just kind of up my alley, if you will. But I recognize that it's not for everyone. But I would suggest to you this evening that understanding this history will help us to understand the Bible much better. The Bible is a book of history. It's sacred history. It talks about the history of God's dealings with mankind, but it is history nonetheless. And so we're going to cover lots of history in these lessons. Briefly in the class, we're going to cover some relevant biblical texts. For example, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, and Daniel chapter 7 through 12. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time in those books because I generally will do other studies on those books themselves, but we're going to pull those in as necessary to cover this period. We're also going to cover in this class Jewish non-canonical literature. And what I mean by that, we'll get into this later in the class, but what I mean by that is we're going to cover Jewish literature that comes out of this period that isn't inspired and was not a part of God's Word, and yet gives us a great deal of information about understanding Jewish thinking and Jewish history during the period. So we're going to cover some Jewish non-canonical literature, and I always kind of enjoy that in the class because we read some things like we read or we talk about the story of the dragon in Daniel. Well, there's no dragon in the biblical book of Daniel, but there's a dragon in Jewish non-canonical literature. And so we'll talk about that in the course of this class. And I enjoy that because it's a literature that most of us as Christians are really just not familiar with. We're also going to cover in this class various topics that are related to this period. Okay, so it's not just history. We're going to talk about the Old Testament in Greek and what that's all about. So we're going to cover some other topics as well that come out of this period. So it's not just a class of history, it's a class of history and it's literature, and there's some other things about culture and language that go along with that. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this class. And again, I hope that you're going to be willing to join us on Thursday evenings at 7 p.m. as we go through this material. All right, so that's all the introduction that I want to give, but the title for this evening's lecture is The Jews in Babylon. And so we're going to spend some time talking about the Babylonian Empire. We're going to spend some time talking about how it related to the Jews. The Jews really did not fare well under the Babylonian Empire, at least not at the beginning. We'll look that there's a shift after they're completely conquered to how they're going to fare, but at the beginning, when they first encounter the Babylonian Empire in a very major way, the Babylonian Empire is an enemy state. So let's spend some time talking about the Babylonian Empire. I've got on my slide there the Neo-Babylonian Empire. I'm not going to say Neo-Babylonian all evening because that's just too hard to say. We're really just going to call it the Babylonian Empire, but it's distinguished from the old Babylonian Empire. This is a newer, a more recent Babylonian empire that lasted from 626 to 539 BC. And this is a crucial period. These years are a crucial period in Jewish history, in Jewish Old Testament history as they interact with this empire. But let's begin, if you will, at the beginning. When we talk about the Babylonian Empire, there is a power vacuum in the ancient Near East during the opening period of those dates as Assyria's power wanes. Assyria had been the major world power in this part of the world, but like all empires, eventually their power is going to go down. They're going to lose power, and that begins to happen for Assyria. In the course of time, in 626 BC, a man whose name was Nabopolassar seized the throne of Babylon. And in 612 BC, Nineveh, which is the Assyrian capital, falls to a coalition of Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians. What's interesting about this is that the Assyrian Empire is incredibly strong, but it falls incredibly quickly. So in 612 BC, Nineveh falls to these Babylonians, Medes, and Scythians that are able to conquer that city. That is not, however, the end of the Assyrian Empire, because the Assyrians are going to be pushed progressively to the west. And in 605, there's another battle that's fought, and that's the Battle of Carchemish. The Battle of Carchemish is one of those battles in world history that's actually pretty important because it decided the fate of the Assyrian Empire. Syria loses. The Babylonians are now the main world empire in the ancient Near East. So 605 BC, the Assyrians are now defeated. We're going to return to that date later in the class. I'm just going to throw that out there for now. In 539 BC, Babylon then falls to the Medes and Persians. So if you look at the dates up there, the Babylonian Empire starts in 626 and it ends in 539. The Babylonian Empire is an incredibly strong empire, but it is also an incredibly short-lived empire. It lasts less than 100 years from start to finish. Let's pull up a map just to kind of get an idea for how large the empire was. This is a map that I've got from Logos Bible Software, and the green there represents, I'm sorry I don't have a laser pointer that I can point to that, but the green there represents the Babylonian kingdom, or the Babylonian Empire, the empire that we're talking about. And of course it stretches all the way from the Persian Gulf, lower Mesopotamia, all the way north into what's today Turkey, then all the way down south into Palestine, and it stretches into Egypt. Egypt became a part of the Babylonian Empire for a while as well. The purple empire up there is the Median kingdom. We're not going to talk about the Medes in this class, but we're going to talk about them in the next class, because they're going to show up again when they join up with the Persians to go against the Babylonians. The red over there, we don't need to pay any attention to them at all. Those are the Lydians. They're not important for our story this evening. So that's the empire that Babylon is able to control. And the center of Babylon, the Babylonian Empire, of course, is the city of Babylon, which if you look on that map and you look in the lower right side as you're getting towards the Persian Gulf, you'll see a star there with the name Babylon. That's where the city of Babylon was located. So let's talk a little bit about the city of Babylon itself. It is an extremely old city. In fact, historically, it dates to before 2300 BC. Now, I will tell you that if you tuned in on the class on Babylon in the Bible, we talked about the Tower of Babel. I need to tell you that the biblical Tower of Babel's date is uncertain. We can't date that with any certainty, at least not in my mind you can't, based on the information we have in Genesis. But from an archaeological standpoint, from a historical standpoint, we know that the city of Babylon, not talking about the Tower of Babel, I'm talking about the city of Babylon, existed to at least 2300 BC. In fact, we know that it was before 2300 BC that this city actually existed. It's also an important city straddling the Euphrates River. We're going to show some diagrams here in just a moment, but it was literally built on both banks of the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River, by the way, at Babylon is still a river that can be navigated, and so you have boats on that river. The city of Babylon was a city that had great wealth and power. That great wealth and power was exhibited in numerous ways in the city, not least of which was the ziggurat, and also the numerous temples that were to be found throughout the city of Babylon. There were also the Hanging Gardens. The Hanging Gardens are known only through the writings of historians and geographers, but supposedly King Nebuchadnezzar built the Hanging Gardens for his wife Amytis of Media. Apparently, she missed all the trees and the hills, I guess, of her native land. And so Nebuchadnezzar built the Hanging Gardens specifically for her. We don't have any remains of the Hanging Gardens, and so really all we know about that, it was considered a wonder of the ancient world, we know from what people wrote about it. There was also in the city, and we're going to spend some time looking at this as well, there was the Ishtar Gate and the Processional Way. They were built in about 575 BC by King Nebuchadnezzar, and they were incredible. In fact, the remains of them are incredible as well. So I'd like to pull up a diagram, and I need to thank an individual whose name is Joseph Casals. He is a digital illustrator, and he did some digital illustration of Babylon, ancient Babylon, and I reached out to him, and he graciously agreed to allow me to use some of his images in this presentation. I might just point out that if you'd like to see his work, look him up on the web, because he has some incredible diagrams of ancient structures and ancient buildings, and as well as some others. He's a very talented digital artist. But he did this diagram of ancient Babylon. And I'd just like to point out some things that are on the map. So if you look up on the top of the diagram there, I add the words Euphrates River, just so that we understand that that river that's running through the city of Babylon is the Euphrates River. It starts way up north, it continues down through Babylon, and of course it ends in the Persian Gulf. Also, we note on the picture that there are some outer moat. There's an outer moat and there's some outer walls of the city of Babylon. The central city was very large and very heavily occupied. A lot of people living in that city. Then you had this outer city that was not as densely populated, that had a moat going around it and walls going around it as well. The city of Babylon was probably at this time in world history the largest city in this part of the world. So let's pull up another digital diagram that Casals did. This is I'm sorry, I've got two more things to point out there. I forgot about those. There's a little red circle there. I know that's hard to see, but that's the Ishtar Gate. We're going to look at that in just a moment. And then finally, our last circle there in yellow is the ziggurat. The ziggurat was a structure that towered above the rest of the city. You can kind of get a feel for that in that diagram, but it would have been a structure that would have probably been visible from just about anywhere else in the city because it was so tall. It was an artificial mountain with a temple built on top of it. It was kind of like a pyramid, but not like the Egyptian pyramids. It was a step pyramid, and on the top was that temple. The idea being that since Mesopotamia is pretty flat, we make an artificial mountain so that we can put a temple on top so that we can get as close to the gods as possible. So let's go ahead and move on to the next chart, or the next diagram, the next digital diagram. This gives us a good feel for the Euphrates moving through the city of Babylon, and some boats that are running on the Euphrates River. It was navigable at this point, so you would have trade goods going up and down, other vessels as well. It was an important artery for transportation. You notice on both sides of the river, you have these very massive walls. Babylon's walls were incredibly massive walls. It was a strong city. It was a wealthy city, and they built walls that would reflect that. Let's look at those walls a little bit more. Here's another digital diagram. Of course, you see all the houses in the background there in the city. And here you have the lower wall and the upper wall and the towers. It would have been formidable. To conquer Babylon would have been a great undertaking. And by the way, Babylon was conquered. It's conquered by the Persians. We're going to talk about that next week on Thursday night. It's an interesting story. It's a great story of how the Persians were able to take this city. So let's look a little bit at some of the rulers of Babylon. The first of those, of course, we already mentioned was Nabopolassar. He reigns from 626 to 605 BC. He's followed on the throne by Nebuchadnezzar II. We just call him Nebuchadnezzar. He reigns from 605 to 562 BC. If any king would be considered synonymous with Babylon, it would be Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar really was, in a very real way, he was Babylon. 605 to 562 BC. He is mentioned extensively in the Old Testament. In fact, he is mentioned 91 times in the Old Testament, and Daniel provides a detailed view of this king. And the picture that Daniel gives very much is in accord with what we know from world history about Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was the one who was responsible for the conquest of the kingdom of Judah, which marks the beginning of the captivity period. And we're going to talk about that later in this class as well. So Nebuchadnezzar, again, 605 to 562, he was responsible for building some things in the city of Babylon. We already talked about the Hanging Gardens that we don't have any remains of, but he's also the individual, he's also the king that built the Ishtar Gate and the processional way. And so I'd like to share just a couple of photos. Ivana and I, a couple of years before we moved to America, had the opportunity to travel to Berlin, and we had the opportunity to see the altar of Zeus in Pergamum is in that museum, but we got to see the Ishtar Gate as well. And we got to take some pictures of that. I thoroughly enjoyed that. It was kind of a trip of a lifetime, if you will, to see these things. But the Ishtar Gate was excavated. Babylon was excavated by German archaeologists. And so what they took away to Germany and ended up in Berlin in this museum. They reconstructed the Ishtar Gate. And I took this photo with the guard there standing in the picture because it would give forever it would give me the ability to compare the size of this gate to people. I don't think the guard would have moved anyways, even I'd asked him, but he stood there, I took my picture, and it gives you an idea for the size of that gate. But I got to tell you, when they excavated the gate and they got it to Berlin, they ended up having to shorten the gate because the museum wasn't tall enough for it. So the original Ishtar Gate was actually taller than what's here in the picture. If you look at that gate and look at that walls, in the ancient world, nothing larger than a camel would have gone through a city gate. Camel could have gone through that with plenty of room to spare. A gate this big is built to impress. And in fact, that's what Nebuchadnezzar was doing by building this gate in this way and by building the processional way. Also have another photo here. This is a lion. You might see in that first photo that there are some animals that are depicted. One of those animals that's depicted in the gate and on the processional way are the lions. I like that picture. I like the fact that lion was there because, of course, it reminds us of the story of Daniel from our Bibles in the lion's den there in Babylon. So the Ishtar Gate and the processional way. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to make sure that everybody understood that it was Nebuchadnezzar who built this. And so he left an inscription so that everybody would understand that it was he who did this wonderful thing. The inscription reads, I, Nebuchadnezzar, laid the foundation of the gates down to the groundwater level and had them built up out of pure blue stone. Upon the walls in the inner room of the gate are bulls and dragons, and thus I magnificently adorned them with luxurious splendor for all mankind to behold in awe. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to make sure that people were awed as they entered the city of Babylon through this gate. All right. So again, going back to another digital diagram, again by Mr. Casals. This is his diagram of the Ishtar Gate. And of course, the part that's in the museum is that front part down there at the bottom. And you can kind of see that that's actually the shorter part of the entire gate structure. Gates, of course, were very, very important. They were the weak points in the wall, and so they were usually heavily fortified and heavily guarded. The Ishtar Gate was that kind of a gate. We'll get another picture here. Recreation of it from ground level. Get a feel again for how impressive that would have been. You see there on the left side the lions in the processional way. Processional way led from the gate into the city. Nebuchadnezzar again had that built in about 575 BC. I might point out sometimes it said that Daniel and his friends, when they're carried off to Babylon, would have walked through the Ishtar Gate. Well, no, they wouldn't have, because the Ishtar Gate isn't built until later. But I have no doubt that Daniel and his friends would have been aware of it being built, probably walked past it as it was being built, maybe even had something to do with it being built. All right, so we talk about Babylon. It's very interesting to look at all that. But what's important for us for the purposes of this class is to understand how Babylon interacted with the Jews, with the kingdom of Judah, with the house of David, because it's the Babylonians that are going to take the Jews off into final captivity. So let's spend some time talking about the final kings of the house of David, and we're going to talk about several here. And the first one we're going to talk about is King Josiah. King Josiah reigns from 641 to 609 BC. So it's a pretty long reign. It's about 32 years that he's king. Josiah, of course, is one of those kings that's well known. He was a righteous king. The scriptures tell us that. He was interested in following God's law. He was interested in doing what was right. He reigns from 641 to 609 BC. Unfortunately, Josiah is killed at Megiddo by Pharaoh Necho of Egypt. And so I want to talk about that just a little bit, because this is one of those central events in biblical history that really affects what happens after that. Josiah in 609 ends up being killed at Megiddo by this Egyptian pharaoh. So I'm going to pull up a map to kind of explain what's going on here. You may remember that we talked about that Babylon is on the ascendancy. In 612 BC, Nineveh Falls. You might find that at the end of that yellow line up there on the map. It's in Assyria there. It's north of Babylon. So 612 Nineveh Falls, but the Assyrians are not defeated. So they retreat to the west. They end up going to Haran, and then they end up going even farther west to a place called Carchemish. So Carchemish is really, really important. It's that battle that's fought in 605 BC that really is going to alter the course of world history. So the Babylonians, along with the Medians, those are their allies, they're progressively chipping away at Assyrian territory. They're pushing the Assyrians to the west. But then you've got the Egyptians. The Egyptians still have a pretty strong kingdom down there in Egypt. And Pharaoh Necho is kind of concerned about what's going on with the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And Necho's idea is, well, I'm going to go up there and I'm going to assist the Assyrians. They're kind of weak anyways. I don't want the Babylonians to be able to completely knock them off. And so the Egyptians are going to move up and intervene in this conflict on the side of the Assyrians. Well, as I said, Egypt comes up to aid the Assyrians. Josiah's looking at all this in Jerusalem. He knows the Egyptians are coming. He knows what's going on up there in Carchemish. And Josiah decides to take sides. And the side that he chooses are the Babylonians. So he wants to go out and prevent the Egyptians from being able to join up with the Assyrians. He goes out to stop the Egyptians, and he ends up being killed in battle at Megiddo. And of course, then the Egyptians are going to continue on north. They're going to help out in Carchemish. The Battle of Carchemish the final Battle of Carchemish, I should say, is not fought until 605, so it's 4 years after this. What's going on here is the strategic passes that go through Palestine or go through Canaan. So we're going to go back in time a little bit. Megiddo has been a flashpoint for a long time. There have been several battles of Megiddo. You can go online and find out all about these. Even into modern times, there have been battles at Megiddo. Well, one of those significant battles is fought in about 1480 BC. Pharaoh Thutmose III of Egypt goes up to take Megiddo. There are 3 passes. If you look at that map, you can see all the hills there and the mountains there. There are 3 passes that will go through and get to the Jezreel Valley. One of those is the Jokneam Pass, the other is the Megiddo Pass, and the third one is the Dothan Pass. Thutmose III knew of all of those other passes. In fact, his generals recommended them, that's Jokneam and Dothan, over the Megiddo Pass. Don't go through the Megiddo Pass. Go up through the other 2. But Thutmose chose to go through the middle pass and only sent some diversionary troops over to Jokneam and Tanakh, to those passes. And so he's able to get through, and he's able to take the city of Megiddo. This is the exact same scenario that Josiah and Necho have in 609 BC. So let's kind of zoom in a little bit on that map. We have Megiddo there circled in red. We have the Judahites, or the people of the kingdom of Judah, the army of Judah, have moved into the Jezreel Valley. They're going to fight against the Egyptians. The Egyptians are going to come up through the Megiddo Pass. Once they've gone through the pass, then they're able to continue on north and reach Carchemish. So Josiah's idea is to block them at that pass, to keep them from being able to go through, to delay them, if not completely eliminate that possibility. Again, Josiah is killed in battle, and so the Egyptians are able to march on through, and they join up with the Assyrians up there at Carchemish. This is a photograph of the area. This is the Tel Megiddo is there in the background. You can't hardly see that, so I wrote it on the map. There's a black arrow there. You can see that. That is Megiddo. That's ancient Megiddo. The pass is right there where that modern highway is. And so if you think about the modern highway being built on this ancient pass that armies had been using back and forth over the centuries to pass from one side of all of that hilly country into the Jezreel Valley. And so again, Josiah goes up to try to stop Pharaoh there. He's killed in battle. The Egyptians are able to go on up and join the Assyrians. But Josiah's death will set in motion a series of events that are going to result in the end of the house of David. So let's just look at some more of those events. Again, Josiah, 609, killed at Megiddo. Following his death, Necho is obviously calling the shots. The people make Jehoahaz, who was Josiah's son, they make him king in 609 BC. Necho comes along and says, no, y'all don't have the right to decide who's going to be the next king. I'm the overlord here. I'm going to decide who the next king is. Jehoahaz, you're not going to be king. So he takes Jehoahaz back to Egypt. He puts in his place Jehoiakim on the throne. Jehoiakim is going to be on the throne from 609 to 598 BC. Now, he's made king by Necho. He's a vassal, however, of Babylon from 605. So what happens is, remember, you've got 609, the battle at Megiddo. Josiah's killed. The Battle of Carchemish is 4 years later in 605 BC. So the Egyptians haven't been defeated yet. So all of this area, Judah, is now going to be over the control of Egypt. And so Jehoiakim is a vassal of Egypt under Necho until 605. When the Babylonians win at Carchemish in 605, Judah is going to fall under their control. And so they're not going to completely occupy and conquer the land, but they're going to have vassal kings. And so Jehoiakim is going to continue to rule, but now he's responsible to the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar in this case. Well, he rebels against that rule. He ends up being deposed, and the circumstances of his death are unknown. We know he's carried away in chains, but the Bible doesn't tell us exactly what happened to him. After him, Jehoiachin is placed on the throne, and he reigns for 3 months from 598 across that dividing between 598 and 597. He's going to reign 3 months. All right, let's talk a little bit about those dates that we looked at so far. So 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, to establish his authority over Judah, takes captives from Judah, and in doing that, he assures that the Judahites, the kingdom of Judah, are going to comply with his overlordship. The captives that he takes are from the royal family. They're from the noble families, and he takes them off to Babylon. So the idea here, he's going to educate them to be good Babylonian administrators, but the idea also is their mothers and fathers are back in Judah. They know we have their sons. Surely they are going to behave themselves. Well, among these captives that are taken in 605 BC are Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These are the four main characters of the book of Daniel. Now, we usually know Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah by their other names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel we know as Daniel. But these are the four, among others, who are carried off to Babylon. Those are the ones that are central to the story of the book of Daniel. 597 BC, Jehoiachin is deposed, and he's replaced by Zedekiah. And in that year, a second group of hostages is taken off to Babylon. Now, among those hostages is Ezekiel. Daniel is operating in the city of Babylon, in the royal court. Ezekiel is operating, he's a prophet, he's operating among the captives in the region of Babylonia. But he gets carried off in 597. All right, we have an archaeological artifact. This is a clay tablet. It's part of the Babylonian Chronicle. And these clay tablets, a lot of clay tablets have been uncovered archaeologically over there. This series of clay tablets are known as the Babylonian Chronicles. They record the deeds of the kings of Babylon. You know, the kings wanted to make sure everybody knew what they had done. They wanted to have a history of what they had done. And so they kept these chronicles. This particular tablet that's here in this picture chronicles the years 605 to 594 BC and includes Nebuchadnezzar's first campaign against Jerusalem in 597. That's recorded in 2 Kings chapter 24, verses 8 through 17. All right, so let's continue on and looking at those final kings of the house of David. Jehoiachin is taken captive to Babylon. Now, interestingly about Jehoiachin, he lives until at least 562 BC. So he's taken off to Babylon, but he isn't killed. He ends up being imprisoned there for a while, and then later he's actually going to eat at the king's table. So we know that he lives at least until 562 BC, but he's taken off the throne. In his place, the Babylonians place Zedekiah. Zedekiah is going to reign from 597 to 586. He is the last king of Judah. He is the last king of the house of David. When his kingdom ends, it's the end of the kingdom of Judah. He rebels against Babylon. The Babylonians come, they besiege the city of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem falls. All right, so let's just note some of these events of 586. Okay, so Zedekiah rebels against Babylon. We have the siege and fall of Jerusalem. That is described in the scriptures. When the city falls, the temple is destroyed, the houses are burned, and the walls are demolished. The Babylonians are absolutely determined that Jerusalem is not going to cause any more problems for their empire. And so that's how they handle it. They destroy the temple, they burn the houses, they demolish the walls. Zedekiah is captured, his sons are captured, his sons are executed, and then he is blinded, and he's carried off to Babylon. So the last thing that Zedekiah will see in his life is the death of his sons. What that means to him is, it's humiliating, of course, but it also means this is the end of your dynasty. In 586 as well, more captives are taken to Babylon. So, 586 is a watershed date. Usually when I teach this class and I talk to the students, I tell them there are 3 dates you need to remember for the Southern Kingdom. You need to remember 605, you need to remember 597, you need to remember 586. Those are the 3 important dates because it's in those 3 years that captives are carried off into Babylon. The captivity dates from 605, but it culminates in its final group being taken away in 586. And what I usually tell those students in my class is if you're ever on Jeopardy and the final question is name those 3 dates and you win a whole bunch of money, I hope that you'll remember me and I hope that you'll split that with me since I drilled these dates into you over and over in the class. 586 is an important date for the history of the kingdom of Judah. All right, but there are some other leaders or rulers of Babylon, if you will. We're just going to talk about these guys really briefly. The first of those is Nergal-Sar-Ezer. He reigns from 559 to 556 BC. He's otherwise known as Neriglissar. He's mentioned in Jeremiah chapter 39 and verse 13, and he is Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law, and he's the next king on the throne after Nebuchadnezzar. Following him, we have a fellow whose name was Labashi-Marduk. He reigns in 556. He was Neriglissar's son, and he rules for 3 months. Following him, then, we have Nabonidus. Nabonidus reigns from 555 to 539 BC. We don't know a whole lot about Nabonidus, except that it's assumed historically that he was married to Nebuchadnezzar's daughter, whose name was Nitocris. So that would have made him Nebuchadnezzar's son-in-law as well. He reigns for 3 years in Babylon. Then he leaves to live at the oasis at Taima. Kind of lives a mystical type monkish life. So he reigns as king for 3 years, and he says, I've had enough of this king type life. I'm going to go and spend my time in the oasis looking for visions or whatever it is he was doing out there. He leaves, however, his son on the throne. His son is Belshazzar. Belshazzar is co-regent with his father from 553 to 556 BC. He is and then of course from 556, after his dad leaves, he's the only really king there. He's the effective king, if you will. He's actually a prince, not a king. He's second in the kingdom of the Babylonian Empire. And Belshazzar is talked about in the book of Daniel. His last night is recorded in Daniel chapter 5. We're not going to talk about Daniel chapter 5 tonight, because Daniel chapter 5 is really, really important when we talk about the Jews under Persian rule, and that'll be next week. Let's just notice another artifact that has to do with these fellows. This is called the Cylinder of Nabonidus. Clay foundation cylinders were placed inside the walls of buildings as a record of a king's achievements. Okay? This particular cylinder describes the rebuilding of a ziggurat by Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon. Nabonidus, on this cylinder, in that cuneiform script, prays for his son Belshazzar, who ruled Babylon while he was away. And we read about this, Daniel chapter 5, Daniel chapter 7, and 8. So we have here an archaeological artifact that confirms the existence of Belshazzar and the fact that he was Nabonidus' son. All right, let's just kind of sum this up a little bit. We're drawing to the end of this period this week. We talk about the Jews in Babylon. It's interesting to note that you've had these groups of captives that have been carried away into Babylonian captivity. Of course, the northern kingdom, the kingdom of Israel, is long since gone. They're conquered by the Assyrians. They're carried away into captivity as well. But the Jews are carried away into captivity, but a small population is left in Judah. Lots of Jews have died in the course of all of these wars that have gone on. Some have now been carried off into captivity. In fact, that number is about 10,000. So about 10,000 Jews have been taken to Babylon and into captivity in 3 waves: 605, 597, 586. See, those are those 3 dates again that are really, really good to remember. There's a small population, however, that's left in Judah. There's no state there anymore. It's now just absorbed into the Babylonian Empire. It's made into a province, but there are some Jews that are left there. The captives are taken off to Babylon, and Jeremiah the prophet, in Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 4 through 11, basically tells these folks, you need to make yourselves at home. There had been some prophets that had been prophesying that the Jews would be in Babylonian captivity for a couple of years. Jeremiah says, no, it's not going to be for a couple of years. You need to make yourselves at home. In fact, the Babylonian captivity, lasted for 70 years. At the end of 70 years, under Persian rule, Jews are allowed to go home. But there were a whole lot of Jews in Mesopotamia that had made themselves very much at home, and even when they had the opportunity to return, didn't choose to do so. And we read about some of those people. For example, we read about Esther. She didn't go back to Judah. She stayed in Mesopotamia. We read about Daniel and his friends as well, that there's no record of them having gone back. The captivity lasts 7 years. Again, some Jews never returned. Interestingly, up until 1948, there actually was a significant Jewish population in Mesopotamia. In fact, there were about 100,000 of them living in that region of the world. Today there are fewer than 100 Jews living in Mesopotamia. So truly, a lot of these folks went over there in the captivity. They stayed there. They never went back. In Acts chapter 2, when we read about all the Jews that had assembled on the day of Pentecost in Jerusalem, we read about Jews that were there, that had traveled there from the areas of the captivity. So the Jews in Babylon, if I could kind of summarize this, when Babylon is making war against the kingdom of Judah, the Jews are not doing so well. Okay, they're losing. They're under their control. They're going to be completely and totally defeated in 586 BC. But once the Jews get into captivity, they're actually, by and large, going to do very well. They're actually going to prosper pretty nicely under Babylonian control and then later under Persian control as well. So next Thursday evening at 7 o'clock, we're going to talk about the Jews under Persia. We're continuing with this historical period to kind of give us the historical overview of the period and what's going on with the Jews, with God's people. So next Thursday at 7 p.m., we're going to look at what happens after the Babylonians when the Jews are under Persian control. And I do hope that you will join us at that time for that particular Bible study. Again, if you've got some questions or you got some comments that you'd like to leave, you can put those on the Facebook Live event, or you can email those to me, message those to me, and I'll have a look at those and I'll try to give you an answer to those questions that you have. Again, thank you for tuning in. I wish all of you a good evening and stay safe, and God bless.